I really started it I started thinking about the idea at the time of the financial crisis and when I was making my last film called The Queen of Versailles. And at that point, I started to think that maybe the hundreds of stories that I had photographed since the 90s about subjects as diverse as materialism, celebrity, consumerism, the way these values have been exported abroad, media, body image, the commodification of the female body, that in a way, all of these subjects I thought might be connected and might tell a bigger story about how we've changed as a culture. I started to think about this journey that I've been on for 25 years and how it's been a time of radical change. And radical change with technology, with globalism, but also in our values. And how in a way I could track the kind of corruption of the American dream and the way this dream has been exported around the world in the work. So I started thinking about the pictures as a kind of evidence of our cultural change. And so I began a journey with a curator, Trudy Wilnerstack, of going through pictures. And in the beginning, I thought it was going to be a couple file cabinets of pictures because I was really thinking about it much smaller. Money, consumerism. And as I started delving into it, I started seeing the connections between all of these different subjects I had photographed and looked at also in my films. And so it got bigger and bigger. And I ended up going through more than 500,000 pictures and scanning over 10,000 pictures. And it started as this working on this exhibition and a book, and then I ended up feeling like I also had to make a film about it. So I ended up working on it for about full-time about 6 years. But really, the idea kind of came to me around 2008 with the crash.
So there's both a cultural change and a Lauren Greenfield history in the project. Let's talk about the cultural change. What you said, the corruption of the American dream. How would you describe it?
Well, so my early work, my first project was about kids growing up in LA, and it was about how they were affected by what I called the values of Hollywood. Materialism, celebrity, image. I started with rich kids in a very privileged school and ended up looking at all different kinds of kids, realizing that it went beyond social class and everybody in their own way both wanted more and wanted to be noticed, wanted fame. So this was the project that really I kind of found my photographic voice in. And looking back, around the time of the crash, I started to see that there were so many things in our culture that had started then in the early 90s, that it was in a way the beginning of so many ideas and trends and phenomena that just blew up. And so I wanted to go back and kind of track that change. One of the icons of that change was Kim Kardashian, who when I went back through the outtakes and going through all the old pictures, I found a picture of her at 12 years old, which is in the show. This picture was not in my original book or show because she was a nobody then, but she becomes a really important cultural touchstone for me on a lot of levels. One, the boom in reality TV and this idea of like being famous for nothing and being famous for lifestyle for its own sake, that being rich kind of makes you worthy of elevation and aspiration. Also the fact that she starts with a sex tape, and that I spent a lot of time looking at gender and the commodification of women's bodies. And for me, the story about Kim Kardashian is amazing because it's not a scarlet letter, it's a badge of honor. And that it's what allows her to leverage and catapult into this business and lifestyle and kind of aspirational role model for kids all over the world. And that it's not about how you get there, it's just about getting there. And then the other part that was really important to me in looking at the change was that the American dream always had a materialistic component. That part is not new. Buying a house has always been central to the American dream. Competing with your neighbors has always been central to it. The idea of keeping up with the Joneses, maybe looking to your neighbor who has the little bit better house or the little bit better car and aspiring to that. What happened in the last 25 years, and a lot of my work has also been about looking at how the media has changed and how the media has become a bigger influence in our lives, and particularly the lives of young people and the vulnerable, kind of shaping their identities. What's happened in the last 25 years is people spend more time with the characters that they know on TV than their actual neighbors. And they start to want what they have. That the research shows that the more you see images of luxury and wealth on TV, the more you think it's normal and that you should have that too. And so we start this aspirational gap where there's no connection between what people can afford and what they want. And that's why the financial boom and crash is so important to my work. And that's a big part of this show at the Louisiana. Because in a way, the time of free money and free lending and low interest rates allowed working class people, middle class people, European people, all different kinds, not the very rich, to feel like they were rich, to add a pool or get a better car or have a designer purse, even if that was the only designer item they had to kind of go out into the world with. And that was, and in a way, the crash was the kind of morality tale of that, of our going after, of our being kind of sucked into greed and thinking like buying these things or having these things was going to give us the life that we wanted. And in a way, the crash was the consequence.
But it's a very short morality tale, because we are there again today, and it has become global, because this project is not only about Hollywood or Los Angeles or America, it's about Europe, China, Russia.
I mean, in a way, it's about human nature, but it's not just about human nature, because it's also about how human nature is exploited in the current kind of late stage capitalism, that there's so many ways to manipulate our insecurities and our vulnerabilities. And that's why I focus on children, I focus on women, I focus on countries like China and Russia desiring to kind of have, in a way, the capitalist kind of society that we do. And we, after the crash, and really the inspiration for Generation Wealth is that so many lessons were learned during the crash, but then after the crash, we seem to go right back to where we had been before. I saw this really strongly in the family from the Queen of Versailles, the Siegels, because at the end of the Queen of Versailles, they've learned their lessons in the most unexpected way. David Siegel says, I should have been happy with fewer buildings, then none of this would have happened. Jackie Siegel says, all that matters is my family. I should have been happy in a 2-bedroom house, apartment. And yet, when the economy comes back, they go back to building the house. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. That made me really think hard about where this was going and why. And I really came to that it's not about a goal of achieving a certain thing, but it's really about addiction. And that the addiction is not just to money or wealth or consumerism, but it's also about everything that gives us value, being addicted to beauty, to fame, to youth. And that in the metaphor of addiction, or in the addiction model, you just keep going until you crash and hit rock bottom. And in a way, that's the story of Generation Wealth, and really very strongly, it's the story of the movie Generation Wealth, that we see all of these crashes, both personal and collective. And it's actually in the crashes that there's the possibility for insight and maybe even change and agency, and certainly hope. And so, in a way, the movie has a surprisingly hopeful ending as we kind of barrel at full speed toward the apocalypse. The thing about the subjects in Generation Wealth is they are incredibly diverse. And one thing I was really looking for was the commonalities among people from completely diverse backgrounds. So the very rich, the 1%, have a role in this book and this show because they're the people in a way whose images the rest of us are kind of being influenced by, affected by, making to feel less than by, and then aspiring to. So there's a whole part about the very rich that includes Florian Home, a hedge fund banker that's made over $800 million and then gets indicted by the FBI for white-collar crime, a pump and dump scheme, and has a complete fall where he loses everything. There's Ilona, the wife of an oligarch in Moscow, who comes from a small town where she wasn't rich, and actually the whole former Soviet Union wasn't rich. And she says that there were some advantages. They could play outside, they could have normal lives. Now she's got security outside and big walls around her house. There is Limo Bob, who wears hundreds of pounds of gold, but his story is a more fake it till you make it story. He's about pretending to kind of be a certain way to attract others. There's rich kids in LA who grow up thinking that they should have a Birkin bag, which is an Hermes bag that's in the 5 figures.
And then there's this Chinese person who builds the White House with Mount Rushmore.
Yes. I followed the beginning of Great Wealth in China from 2000 to 2016, and there was a lot of conspicuous consumption. Like there was a billionaire entrepreneur who loved America and built a full-scale replica of the White House. And he worked out of the Oval Office, and the view from his office was Mount Rushmore. There was another Chinese executive woman who had all gold Versace furniture in her room and wasn't a particular fan of golf, but belonged to 5 golf clubs that with an initiation fee of like $50,000 each, because golf is a status symbol and was important for doing business. But if you went into Generation Wealth thinking it's a show about the wealthy, you would be wrong, because it's really about aspiration. And there are many more people in the show and the book that are not wealthy at all, but are trying to have more in some way, whether it's more money, more brands, more beauty, more youth, more currency in all of the ways that we give people value. I mean, the work definitely has a point of view. I have gone into it as a documentarian, but I think a stronger point of view in a way has evolved. So you could maybe call it an artist now, in the sense that it crosses platforms and there is a very kind of specific vision about who we are and where we're going. But I very much come from journalism in my process, and it being fact-based. All of the photographs are naturally taken, nothing is staged. The texts in the show come from people's actual interviews. The voices of the subjects have always been really important to me. So I've definitely been influenced by both journalism, anthropology, and the kind of cinematic arts too, that the stories really have a narrative. I was a photographer for many years before I started making films, but when I began to make films, it was kind of a natural progression because my photography always had a narrative. And even in the show, you'll see that there's a certain direction that I kind of want you to go in and a story that I want to tell.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of text to the pictures.
And in a way, what we tried to do in this show with the design is to give the text, the voices of the subjects, equal weight to the photographs. And that in a way, their perspective is as important to understanding their world and the work as my perspective. And in the voices of the subjects, we often get a kind of critical understanding that you also see in the photographs, that the subjects are not unaware of the kind of forces influencing them. And in a way, sometimes they're the best social critics. They're the ones kind of teaching me what the problems are and where to look. And then other times, the voices completely belie the myth that we see in the picture. For example, the photograph of the Beverly Hills High Senior Ditch Day that's on the cover of my first book, Fast Forward, that kind of looks like the perfect California dream, convertibles, money, beautiful bodies. And yet Mijanu, who's in the foreground of that picture, talks about how hard it was and that she actually wasn't rich, but in a way her beauty and her body was a kind of leverage point, a kind of currency that allowed her to be in that world, and what the cost was for her. And so I think in a way in the voices, it's a kind of unexpected part of the story that actually deepens the photograph. When I began Girl Culture, which was a 5-year project about how the body has become the primary expression of identity for women, I didn't go into it as a feminist, but I came out the other side. And I think with Generation Wealth, it becomes that much more devastating, that the commodification of women's bodies in Generation Wealth is how my work on gender connected to the work on consumerism, that I realized that in a way the commodification of the human body was the ultimate sacrifice and degradation and consequence and cost of capitalism, and that for women this is kind of part of our daily currency. And so you see from little girls playing an innocent game of dress up to women who become sex workers, that there's a kind of continuum, and that it's to aging women and the kind of draconian practices that women have to do to retain their value. That what you see in the work is that as a girl, your value comes from your body and what the consequences are. And I would say that even though the work is not gender-based, in that it's really about how capitalism exploits insecurity and in a way kind of destroys us, but it's in the populations that are most vulnerable, women, children, minorities, that we see the greatest cost. And so it's undeniable in Generation Wealth that it is a feminist work, in that the commodification of the body has such dire consequences for women. And I think in the movie, it becomes really devastating. And I actually had to really think in the movie, and even also in the show, there's some really hard pictures, but I included them because I think it's important to show the full consequence of what we're creating. It's like part of this work is about the pornification of the culture. And that is kind of all around us. And so, and it's glamorized, and it's part of how kids understand sexuality. And it's so deep in the culture that in a way I had to show some very kind of graphic images and stories to understand the cost of that to the women involved, but also to all of the consumers. Same with plastic surgery. That plastic surgery is such an everyday thing. I was surprised when I did this project to learn that 75% of women who get plastic surgery make $50,000 a year or less. So this is not something for rich people. This is the kind of trickle down of luxury that we see all over this work. And a luxury that feels like a necessity to many people because it is intrinsic to their value and their objective value in the world. And so we see really graphic images of plastic surgery because in the popular culture, we see the before and we see the after. And we never see the actual kind of violence and horror of what's involved in the middle. So I felt like it was my obligation to show that, even though I also apologize for how hard that experience can sometimes be. Somebody, when they saw the show, said that I'm documenting the profound side of the superficial. And I wrote an op-ed called The Dangerous Kardashian Effect. In a way, the danger of the superficial. I think that this is not what's in my pictures is not something that can be marginalized, especially in the time of Trump. That much as we might want to say this is not us, this is holding a mirror. And in many ways, the rise of Trump is holding a mirror that we don't necessarily want to look at. But there are a few people in this culture that are not affected in any way by this. Of course, in my work, I often focus on the extremes, either extreme moments or extreme characters, to show this because the popular culture and the way we're affected by it is so all around us that it's hard to see. So in a way to crystallize it, I need to kind of look for these moments. But I think there are few people that will go into the show and read the stories also of the subjects and not identify. And that's also why I made the film. I think that film, even more than photography, is an empathy machine. And that's also why I put myself in the film, that I don't think you can see it and not understand that we're all complicit in this culture. And that's really the point that I wanted to make, that we're on an unsustainable path, both in terms of the environment, in terms of our communities, our families, our kind of feeling whole, our identities, and even our kind of souls, that if we continue on this path, we will kind of self-destruct. And yet there's a possibility, I think, also to wake up and see and choose something different. And that's the story of a lot of the characters in the project, that even though they're in the middle of it, in the belly of the beast, in the words of the subjects, there are a lot of extremely astute insights where people both see the damage, the danger, the problem, and even if they've had their own crash, have learned from it and are trying to kind of teach us. So in a way, for me doing this work, it's a little bit like The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, and I hope the work will be the red pill that kind of, allows us to see what's all around us, but in a slightly different way.
What can we learn from looking at the pictures? Yeah. How can we change our path?
Yeah. Well, in the movie, I kind of lay that out more explicitly because at the end of the movie, almost all of the characters have kind of learned from their mistakes, including me, in terms of getting back to what matters. I think what you get from the work is that this quest for more and more, this kind of gold-plated hamster wheel that Florian describes, is so much a part of our everyday life, but it's clear that it doesn't bring us happiness or satisfaction or any of the things that we think it will bring us. I was really moved by this one Wall Street banker, Sam Polk, who said that in finance, everybody has a number that they say they're going to get to, and they're going to retire and focus on what they really want to do when they hit that number. And then they hit that number and the number changes. And that really spoke to me because my first film was about eating disorders. It was called Thin. And that's what anorexics do. They have a number of pounds they want to get to, and then they get there and they say, it's not good enough. And I realized that that is the addiction part. And for me, where that comes from is a kind of loss of meaning and kind of loss of moral center. And in a way, that's what we see in the film, is people kind of finding that again or realizing the cost. In the photography, Iceland kind of stands as an alternative, because Iceland was a place where in the crash, unlike the US and Europe, they didn't get bailed out. They had to just deal with the consequences. And so I think for Iceland, it became a moment of creative destruction, where they used that moment to really reassess their values and understand that they had lost their moral compass. They decided to make institutional and societal change. They put the perpetrators in jail. They decided testosterone was a part of the problem. They brought women into politics, women into finance. They went back to community-based projects. They started knitting instead of buying foreign goods. And in a way, they went back to the environment, to the fish, to the traditional means of sustenance and wealth. And so I think, of course, Iceland is a very specific example. We can't imitate that in the US, but I think it kind of stands in this work for what's possible, for the idea that change is possible, that in those moments of insight, there's a possibility for a different path.